I had a long layover at Denver International Airport, one of those nights that felt endless. My flight wasn't due for another 6 hours, and the terminal was eerily empty. A few scattered travelers slept awkwardly in their seats, their bags clutched tightly to their chests. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, filling the silence with an almost electric hum. I settled near a row of glass windows, rubbing my eyes as I stared at my own reflection. I looked exhausted, dark circles under my eyes, my hoodie bunched around my shoulders, the dull glow of my phone casting shadows across my face. That's when I noticed something strange. In the reflection, there was a man standing behind me. I went rigid. My first thought was that he was just another traveler passing through, maybe looking for his own seat. But as I studied the reflection, I realized something wasn't right. He wasn't moving. He was standing completely still, hands at his sides, face shadowed beneath the brim of a dark, old-fashioned hat. His suit looked decades out of style, the fabric faded and stiff. The more I stared, the more unnatural he seemed, like something that had been placed there, rather than something that belonged. I turned around, expecting to see him standing behind me. There was no one there. I sucked in a sharp breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I turned back to the window, and my stomach twisted into knots. The man was closer now. He hadn't moved in real life, only in the reflection. A cold dread slithered down my spine. I blinked rapidly, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. I shifted in my seat, pretending to stretch, but my eyes flicked toward the glass again. He was closer. Panic surged through me. I stood up too fast, nearly tripping over my own bag. I needed someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I spotted a security guard near the check-in kiosks and hurried toward him, my breath shaky. "Excuse me," I said. "There's a man following me." The guard, a bored-looking guy in his late 40s, glanced around lazily. "What man?" I pointed toward the row of windows. "Over there." He was right behind me. The guard frowned, scanning the area. "Sir, you've been sitting alone this whole time." I shook my head, frustrated. "No, I saw him in the reflection. He keeps getting closer." At that, the guard gave me a strange look. He must have thought I was drunk or sleep-deprived. "Listen, buddy," he said with a forced chuckle. "Maybe get some coffee. There's no one here but you." I clenched my jaw. He wasn't going to help me. Desperate for proof, I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the window. My fingers felt clammy as I opened the image, praying I'd see nothing but my own reflection. I didn't. The man was right behind me in the photo. But this time his face was visible. His mouth was stretched open in a silent scream. His eyes, dark, sunken, and impossibly deep, stared straight into mine. I felt my stomach drop. My breath caught in my throat. It was real. I spun around expecting, no dreading, to see him standing right there. But there was still nothing. Just the empty, silent terminal stretching out around me. I backed away, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The photo burned in my mind, the image of that twisted, screaming face refusing to fade. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and moved toward the security checkpoint, my body running on pure adrenaline. The few travelers left in the terminal paid me no attention, their heads buried in their phones or slumped against the backs of chairs in sleep. I avoided every reflective surface as I walked, afraid to see that thing again. Every time I passed a polished floor, a vending machine, or a darkened TV screen, I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look. But then I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't words exactly, just a faint, rasping sound that sent ice through my veins. It was coming from behind me. I stopped walking. The air around me felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. My hands trembled as I slowly turned my head, just enough to catch a glimpse of a nearby glass panel. The man was there, but this time he wasn't just standing still. He was reaching for me, his long fingers pressed against the glass, his mouth still frozen in that ghastly, silent scream. And for the first time, I saw his lips move. "Let me out." A scream bubbled in my throat, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, nearly colliding with a row of chairs. My head spun, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wasn't safe. I couldn't stay here. I ran. I don't remember much of those frantic moments. Just flashes of sterile airport walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the pounding of my own footsteps against the tile floor. I made it to a bathroom and locked myself in one of the stalls, pressing my back against the cold metal door. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't dare check. Eventually, I forced myself to leave. The terminal was still eerily quiet, but something felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. I took slow, measured steps back toward the windows. The man was gone, or so I thought. I made it through the rest of the night without seeing him again, but I never shook the feeling that he was still watching me, just beyond the glass. When my flight was finally called, I all but sprinted onto the plane, refusing to look at any of the darkened windows around me. I didn't sleep on that flight. I don't think I've truly rested since. Because now, whenever I pass a mirror, a window, or even the reflection in a puddle, I swear I see movement that isn't mine. And sometimes, I see a man in an old-fashioned suit, getting closer. I was exhausted. Not the kind of tired you feel after a long day, but the kind that seeps into your bones, that makes the world feel hazy, like you're walking through a dream you can't wake up from. My flight out of O'Hare had been delayed, twice now, and I was starting to think I'd never get out of this place. I checked the time on my phone. 11:47 p.m. The terminal was still packed, but there was a strange emptiness to it. Tired travelers slumped in their seats, mindlessly scrolling through their phones or sipping stale coffee. The overhead announcements droned on, a looping chorus of apologies and rescheduled flights. I sank into a chair near my gate, rubbing my temples. That's when I noticed him. An older gentleman sat just a few seats away, hands folded neatly in his lap. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, the kind that had gone out of style decades ago. The fabric looked stiff, like it had been ironed one too many times. But it was his skin that unsettled me. It had a waxy quality, stretched too tight over his skull, almost artificial. And then there were his eyes. Too bright, too sharp, like glass beads catching the light. I tried to ignore him, but after a few minutes, he turned and smiled. Waiting for a flight? I nodded. Yeah, been delayed for hours. He nodded back, slow and deliberate. I understand. I'm waiting too. I glanced up at the flight board. Where are you headed? Nowhere, he said. I'm waiting for someone. Something about his tone made me uneasy. Oh, my wife, he said. His smile faltered for a second. She's on flight 767, coming in from Miami. I frowned. I'd been staring at that flight board for hours, memorizing every delay, every change. But there was no flight 767 from Miami. I turned back to him. Are you sure? I don't think that flight's listed. His smile vanished. His forehead creased, and his fingers twitched in his lap. She said she'd be here, he whispered, more to himself than to me. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. A strange chill crept over me. Something about the interaction felt off. 15 minutes passed. I kept telling myself to forget the old man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I walked to the flight desk. A young flight attendant was typing into a computer, her red-painted nails clicking against the keyboard. Excuse me, I said. I was wondering if there's a flight 767 coming in from Miami. The flight attendant's hands froze. Her expression shifted, and she looked at me like I had just said something awful. Sir, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Flight 767 from Miami crashed into the ocean 20 years ago. I felt my stomach drop. No survivors, she added. A cold, sinking feeling spread through my chest. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the rows of seats. The old man was gone. My pulse hammered in my ears as I walked back to where he'd been sitting. His chair was empty. There was no suitcase, no coffee cup, no sign he'd ever been there at all. Except for one thing. A crumpled boarding pass lay on the floor. I bent down and picked it up, my hands shaking as I read the date. 2004. The paper felt brittle, the ink faded at the edges. It was old, really old. I flipped it over, half expecting it to turn to dust in my hands. But it didn't. It was real. And that meant so was he. I don't remember walking back to my seat. All I remember is sitting there, gripping that crumpled ticket, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make sense of it. Was it a prank? Some kind of elaborate joke? Or had I just spoken to a dead man? I kept looking around the terminal, expecting to see him again. But he was gone. I pulled out my phone and started searching for Flight 767. The Wi-Fi was slow, but after a few minutes, I found it. American Airlines Flight 767 crashed en route to Chicago from Miami on March 12, 2004. 189 passengers. No survivors. My breath hitched. I scrolled further. There was a blurry newspaper clipping attached to the article. A list of the deceased. I skimmed it, my eyes darting over names I didn't recognize, until I saw one that made my stomach turn to ice. Walter Hensley. The name meant nothing to me. But the photo? It was him. The same man. The same waxy skin, the same two bright eyes. Staring at me from a decades-old obituary. I dropped my phone. The airport around me suddenly felt wrong. The air was too still. The lights too dim. The people around me, other passengers, security guards, flight attendants, seemed almost frozen, like wax figures in a museum. I needed to get out of there. When my flight was finally called, I all but sprinted to the gate. The plane was half empty, which should have been a blessing, but instead, it felt unnatural. As we took off, I kept my eyes fixed on the window, refusing to look at the other passengers. I don't know when I fell asleep. I don't even remember closing my eyes. But suddenly I was dreaming. I was back in the terminal, but it was empty. The lights flickered. The flight board was blank. And I wasn't alone. Walter Hensley stood across from me, his suit perfectly pressed, his hands folded in front of him. His mouth curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Where's my wife?" he asked. I tried to answer, but my mouth wouldn't move. "She promised she'd be here," he whispered. His voice was softer now, almost pleading. "She said she'd come back to me." A cold breeze swept through the terminal. The lights flickered again. Then I heard it. A distant rumbling. Growing louder. An airplane. It was coming in too fast, its lights blinding, its engines screaming. I tried to run. I tried to move. But I was frozen, my feet glued to the ground. Walter Hensley turned to face the incoming plane, his face stretching into something inhuman. His mouth widening, his eyes burning like headlights. And then impact. I woke up gasping for air. The plane was still mid-flight. The cabin lights were dim. Most of the passengers were asleep. Except for one. A woman sitting 3 rows ahead of me, staring out the window. I don't know why I noticed her. Maybe it was the way she sat so still. Maybe it was the way her dark hair spilled over her shoulders, eerily perfect, like she hadn't moved at all since boarding. Or maybe it was the boarding pass clutched in her hand. Old. Faded. From 2004. My throat went dry. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her profile. And then she whispered, "He's still waiting." I didn't sleep for the rest of the flight. I haven't slept much since. Because I keep thinking about O'Hare. I keep thinking about Walter Hensley. And I keep wondering, if some flights never land, what happens to the passengers who never leave? Red-eye flights are their own kind of hell. I never liked them, but sometimes you don't have a choice. Work calls, family emergencies happen, or maybe you just want to save a few bucks. That's how I ended up on a red-eye from Los Angeles to New York. 6 hours of flying through the dead of night. The plane was half full, which meant a little more breathing room. I had the window seat. The one next to me was occupied by a woman, wrapped in a thick, heavy coat. The kind you wear in a snowstorm, not on a plane. She was already asleep when I sat down. Head tilted slightly, dark hair spilling over her face. She didn't move, not even a twitch. I envied her. Sleep never came easy to me on flights. The plane took off without issue. The usual routine, safety instructions, drink service, passengers already snoring before we hit cruising altitude. I settled in, ordered a Coke, and tried to get comfortable. Somewhere over the Midwest, I must have drifted off. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I had that strange, uneasy feeling. You know the one. When something feels off, but you can't put your finger on it. Then I noticed the flight attendant. She was standing beside me, leaning over the woman next to me. Not just checking on her, staring at her. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted. She reached out, hesitated, then quickly pulled her hand back like she had touched something scalding. She straightened, swallowed hard, and walked away without a word. I frowned. That was weird. Then I saw her whispering to another attendant. The second woman's face drained of color. Within moments, they both hurried toward the cockpit. And then the announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an emergency landing. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. A ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. People murmured, some sat up straighter, others gripped their armrests. No turbulence. No engine trouble. Then why the hell were we landing? I turned to my seatmate. She hadn't moved an inch. A strange, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I reached out and gently shook her arm. Hey, we're landing. Nothing. Her skin was ice cold. I pulled my hand back so fast it was like I had been electrocuted. My heart pounded. I looked up, searching for a flight attendant, but they were all busy. I hesitated, then did something I really didn't want to do. I reached out and pulled her coat back. And that's when I saw her face. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, frozen, lips slightly parted, like she had been caught mid-sentence. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale, tinged with something blue. I jerked away, my breath catching in my throat. She was dead. She had been dead for hours. I shot out of my seat. My pulse was hammering in my ears. The passenger across the aisle saw my face and frowned. "What's wrong?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Then the flight attendant returned. Her expression was carefully controlled, but her eyes darted nervously around the cabin. She leaned down and gently pressed her fingers to the woman's throat. After a second, she yanked her hand back like she had been stung. There was no pulse. She turned and rushed to the front of the plane. Another announcement followed, this time more urgent. Please remain calm and stay in your seats. Panic spread like wildfire. People whispered. Some passengers craned their necks to get a better look at the woman. Someone behind me started praying. I sat there, stiff as a board, staring at the corpse beside me. And then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The seatbelt sign had been on the entire flight. No one had gotten up. No one had moved around the cabin except for the crew. No one had seen her board. The emergency landing was rough. We touched down at a small airport somewhere in Kansas. When the plane finally stopped, the cabin was dead silent. Paramedics boarded almost immediately, moving with quiet urgency. They placed the woman, the body, onto a stretcher and wheeled her away without a word. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Then, just as they were about to close the stretcher, she exhaled. It was a soft, rattling sound, like air escaping a deflating balloon. The paramedics froze. I saw one of them glance at the other, his face pale. "She's been dead for hours," one of them whispered. A terrible silence settled over the cabin. And then the lights flickered. A quiet crackling sound filled the air, like static from an old radio. And I swear, I heard a voice. Soft. Raspy. But I never left. Then silence. The paramedics zipped the stretcher shut and rushed her off the plane. We were herded into a holding area while the airline scrambled to explain what had happened. But there was no explanation. No missing passengers. No reports of a woman who matched her description. No record of her ever boarding the plane. She was just there. And then she wasn't. I thought that was the end of it. But then I checked my phone. I had taken a picture of the in-flight meal earlier. Just something stupid for my Instagram story. I hadn't even looked at it. But when I did, my blood ran cold. Because there, in the reflection of my tray table, I saw her. The woman in the coat. But in the picture, she was staring directly at me. I never took another red-eye flight again. But sometimes, on nights when sleep won't come, when the world feels just a little too still, I think about her. I think about the way she sat so perfectly still, the way the flight attendant backed away in fear. I think about the soft, rattling breath that shouldn't have been possible. And I think about the seatbelt sign, glowing that eerie shade of yellow. The sign that had never turned off. I arrived at LaGuardia late at night, the kind of late where the world feels hollow and the air smells like stale coffee and disinfectant. The airport was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every sound. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant beep of a baggage cart, the shuffle of your own feet. I was tired, the kind of tired that makes your bones ache and your thoughts blur. All I wanted was my suitcase, a cab, and a bed. The baggage claim area was nearly empty. A handful of people stood scattered around the carousel, their faces lit by the glow of their phones or the dull overhead lights. I leaned against a pillar, rubbing my eyes, waiting for the conveyor belt to groan to life. When it did, the sound was jarring, like a scream in the silence. The first suitcase tumbled out, a hard-shelled black one. A man in a wrinkled suit stepped forward, grabbed it, and walked away without a word. No phone call, no greeting to a waiting friend, no sigh of relief. Just silence. I didn't think much of it. People are weird at airports, especially late at night. But then it happened again. And again. A woman in a red coat grabbed her floral print bag and left without a sound. A young guy with headphones around his neck picked up his duffel and walked off, his face blank, his eyes empty. No one spoke. No one even looked at each other. It was like watching a scene from a movie with the sound turned off. I shifted uncomfortably, my skin prickling. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, a tension that made my stomach twist. I told myself it was just fatigue, just the weirdness of late-night travel. But then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rumble of the conveyor belt. I turned my head, trying to pinpoint the sound. It came again, louder this time, a low, hissing whisper like wind through dead leaves. My heart skipped a beat. The sound wasn't coming from the people around me. It was coming from the luggage belt. I took a step closer, my shoes squeaking on the polished floor. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't one voice. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, all overlapping, all murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The words were sharp and guttural, like the hiss of a snake or the crackle of static. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Then my suitcase appeared. It was an old, beat-up thing, scuffed and stained from years of travel. I'd recognize it anywhere. But as it rolled toward me, the whispering stopped. Just like that, the voices were gone, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a weight on my chest. I grabbed the suitcase, my fingers trembling. The moment I touched it, I felt a jolt, like a static shock but colder, sharper. I yanked the bag off the belt and set it down, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the people. They were staring at me. Every single person in the baggage claim area had turned to face me. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, their faces expressionless. No one moved. No one spoke. They just watched me, their gazes locked on mine like I was the most fascinating thing they'd ever seen. I didn't wait to find out why. I grabbed my suitcase and ran, the wheels clattering behind me as I bolted for the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, hailing a cab with shaking hands. The driver gave me a strange look, but didn't say a word as I threw my suitcase into the back seat and climbed in after it. The hotel was a blur. I checked in, rode the elevator, and locked myself in my room, my nerves still on edge. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blank, staring faces, heard that awful whispering. I sat on the edge of the bed, my suitcase at my feet, until the sun came up. When I finally worked up the courage to open the suitcase, I almost wished I hadn't. The clothes inside were neatly folded, just like I'd packed them. But they weren't mine. The shirts were too big, the pants too long. The colors were all wrong, dull browns and grays, nothing I would ever wear. And there was a smell, too, a musty, sour odor that made my stomach churn. I slammed the suitcase shut and pushed it into the corner of the room, as far away from me as possible. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I grabbed the wrong bag? No, it was mine. I was sure of it. The scratches, the stains, the broken zipper, it was mine. But the clothes, they weren't. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I thought about calling the airport, but what would I say? "Hi, I think your baggage claim is haunted." They'd laugh me off the phone. So I stayed in my room, staring at the suitcase, until I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I heard the whispering again. It started softly, like a breeze under the door. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room. The voices were the same, hissing, guttural, speaking in a language that made my skin crawl. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, echoing in my skull. And then the suitcase moved. It shifted, just a little, like something inside was trying to get out. I backed away, my heart hammering, as the lid began to rise. The zipper slid open on its own, the teeth parting with a slow, deliberate hiss. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as the lid lifted higher and higher. I didn't wait to see what was inside. I ran, leaving the suitcase and the whispers behind. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. But I know it's still there, waiting for me. And I know sooner or later, I'll have to go back. Because whatever's in that suitcase, it's not done with me yet. The airport was a ghost town. Not the kind of ghost town you see in movies, with tumbleweeds and creaking saloon doors, but the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. The kind where the air is too still, the lights too bright, and the silence too loud. My flight had been canceled. No explanation, no apology, just a curt announcement over the crackling PA system. I was stuck here, in this nowhere airport, until morning. I wandered aimlessly, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. The terminal was nearly empty, save for a few stranded travelers slumped in uncomfortable chairs, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. I checked the departures board out of habit, even though I knew there were no more flights tonight. That's when I saw it. Gate 13B, now boarding. I blinked. That couldn't be right. This airport didn't have a Gate 13B. I'd flown out of here before, and the gates only went up to 12. But there it was, glowing faintly on the board, the letters flickering like a dying neon sign. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the signs, my footsteps echoing in the empty terminal. The hallway to Gate 13B was tucked away in a corner, almost hidden, like it didn't want to be found. The lights above me flickered as I walked, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with every step, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. At the end of the hallway was the gate. The destination screen above it blinked with those same two words, now boarding. No flight number. No destination. Just those words, glowing in eerie green. I hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But before I could turn back, I noticed the jet bridge. Through the window, I could see a plane waiting outside. My stomach dropped. The plane looked wrong. The windows were pitch black, like they'd been painted over. The fuselage was covered in a strange, reddish-brown substance that could have been rust, or something worse. The wings sagged, as if the plane had been sitting there for decades, forgotten and decaying. And yet, it looked ready to fly. A voice crackled over the speakers, sharp and staticky. Final call for all passengers of Flight 000. I froze. Flight 000? That wasn't a real flight number. I took a step back, my heart pounding. That's when I saw him. A man in a flight attendant's uniform stood at the gate. His smile was too wide, his teeth too white, like they'd been polished to a blinding shine. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Sir," he said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "You don't want to miss your flight." I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted back down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lights flickered faster, the shadows twisting and stretching around me. I didn't stop until I was back in the main terminal, surrounded by the familiar hum of vending machines and the faint chatter of late-night travelers. I found an airport employee, a tired-looking woman in a blue uniform, and asked her about Gate 13B. She frowned, her brow furrowing. "Gate 13B? We don't have a Gate 13B." My stomach churned. But I just saw it. Down that hallway. I pointed, but when I turned to look, the hallway was gone. In its place was a blank wall, smooth and unbroken, like it had never existed. The employee gave me a strange look, half pity, half suspicion. "Are you feeling okay, sir? Maybe you should sit down." I didn't argue. I found a seat and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe it was all in my head. But as I sat there, my hand brushed against something in my pocket. Something I hadn't put there. I pulled it out and stared, my blood turning to ice. It was a boarding pass. For Flight 000. The paper was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. The ink was faded but still legible. My name was printed on it, along with a seat number, 13B. I crumpled the pass and shoved it back into my pocket, my hands shaking. I told myself it was a prank, a trick, anything but what it seemed. But deep down I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that plane, that flight attendant, that too-wide smile. I heard the crackling voice over the speakers, calling for passengers of Flight 000. I told myself it was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the boarding pass stayed with me. No matter how many times I threw it away, it always found its way back into my pocket. I'd wake up in the morning, and there it would be, sitting on my nightstand or tucked into my wallet. I tried burning it once, but the flames wouldn't touch it. The paper just sat there, unscathed, as if mocking me. And then the dream started. In the dreams, I'm back at the airport, standing in front of gate 13B. The flight attendant is there, smiling that too-wide smile, gesturing toward the jet bridge. "You don't want to miss your flight," he says, his voice echoing in my head. I try to run, but my feet won't move. I'm frozen, helpless, as the gate opens and the passengers begin to board. They're not people, not really. Their faces are blurred, their bodies twisted and wrong, like they've been stretched and warped. They shuffle past me, their footsteps silent, their heads bowed. And then I wake up, drenched in sweat, the boarding pass clutched in my hand. I don't know where that plane was going, but I know one thing for sure. I don't ever want to find out. Yet every night the dreams get worse. The gate gets closer. The flight attendant's smile gets wider. And the boarding pass, it's always there, waiting for me. I don't know how much longer I can resist. Because deep down I know the truth. Sooner or later, I'm going to board that plane. And I'm never coming back.